this evening. Got the recording on there, perfect. And I have a presentation that I'm going to be sharing with us all tonight. So let me just get that pulled up for everyone, make sure we can see it. Okay, is everyone able to see this first slide here? I'm gonna assume you can see it unless I hear otherwise. Okay, so tonight.
Yes, I can see it.
Excellent, thank you. So tonight we're going to be talking about understanding and managing screen time. And obviously this is a huge area of concern for many adults. I think it was a huge area of concern 3 years ago, and then we had our pandemic. We're still in our pandemic in various capacities. And so we've noticed a huge increase in screen time for kids, for teenagers, and probably also for ourselves, let's be honest. So we're going to look tonight at a few things around screen time. This is definitely our #1 presentation that we're asked to provide because it's such a big topic. So tonight we're going to look at a few things. We're going to try and understand, human behavior, and specifically adolescent behavior, and why it's so hard for kids to put their screen down, right? This is going to help us as caregivers build empathy and compassion and understanding for why kids are not just able to put their phones away when we ask them to, because it is very difficult for them. We're going to look at video games specifically and why video games are so addictive. This tends to be around, 12, 13 and plus age boys, more so than girls, but definitely more and more girls are getting into video games as well. But we're going to look at some of the reasons why video games are so addictive for kids. Then we're going to pay attention to a few things that we need to pay attention to. So obviously a big one is sleep. Sedentary lifestyle is another one, and then mental health considerations that come from too much screen time. And finally, we're going to have that awkward conversation at the end about sexually explicit content and how we're going to manage that, how we're going to have conversations with our kids, when we should be having conversations with our kids. It might be a little earlier than you think, or than you had the conversation when you were a kid. So just trying to keep an open mind around some of this material. And as Andrea mentioned, there's going to be time for questions at the end that you can either ask out loud or type into the chat if you feel more comfortable doing that. Okay, so let's dive in. Before we dive in, actually, I want to make sure everybody knows about this amazing resource that is available online to all. It's commonsensemedia.org. And maybe Deja, if you don't mind, if you could just pop that into the chat. So Common Sense Media, we're not affiliated with them in any way, so this is not a plug for us to increase our shares. This is simply a great resource for anyone who works with kids or parents' kids around getting a review of what your kids are getting into. So if your child comes home and says, hey, I really want to get Fortnite, and you've never heard of Fortnite before because you live in under a bit of a rock, you can go on Common Sense Media, type in Fortnite, and it'll tell you exactly what to expect from this game, right? So it reviews books, it reviews movies and television shows, but it also reviews games and social media apps. So similarly, if you don't really understand what happens on Snapchat, you just go to Common Sense Media, you type it in, and it will tell you which age is appropriate for people to use Snapchat. It also tells you things to pay attention to, whether there's violence, language, drug and alcohol references. So it's a very, very comprehensive resource for parents. I really highly recommend it. It would take me all night to go through everything that is on the internet. So that's why I'm just going to send you to this website, and the ones that are relevant to you and your family, you can do on your own. Okay, so as I said, we've done this presentation probably about 25 times for different groups. And often I get the same questions from parents or guardians as we're delivering this presentation or leading up to this presentation. A lot of it is around, how much time is too much time? Or what are the things that my child should not be doing online? Or what are the things that, what are the negative effects that screens are going to have on the developing brain? And these are really big, daunting questions that without having more context around who you are, who your children are, that I'm not going to be able to answer. And personally, I don't think anyone should be able to answer. What I'm hoping is that after this presentation, that you will have a better sense on how to answer these questions for yourself. And you'll know the things that are relevant to you and the kids that you're looking after. And you're going to be able to make good choices for you and the people that you're caring for. So these are the kind of questions that I'm hoping you'll be able to answer after this presentation. And these are not the kind of questions that I typically get. So I'm just wanting to reframe a little bit the way that we're thinking about screens, right? So instead of thinking, how do screens affect my child's development? I want to start thinking, how does my child's development influence their screen use, right? Why are kids more drawn towards screen use than maybe adults are? Or why is it harder for kids to resist the temptation of going on sites that they know they're not supposed to be on? How can I reduce my own anxiety about screen time? Because let's be honest, a lot of us have anxiety and worry about things that we don't know as much about, right? Our kids get all day to play and to do what they want to do online. And most of us are kind of playing catch up. We have full-time jobs or we have other kids that we need to take care of. And we don't have the luxury of spending 8 hours on Snapchat and figuring out all the different things that we could get into. Things like, how do I encourage my child to come to me and talk to me if they get into trouble online? This is a really big one, right? I think a lot of us, we would say, I want to be the person that my child comes to. I want to be that safe place for them. And sometimes inadvertently, what we do in our conversations with our kids is we're actually communicating to them, I don't actually want to know anything about what's happening, or I might punish you if I find out that something's going wrong. So we're actually communicating to them that I'm not the safe place to come to. So how can we, slow down a little bit, focus our own anxiety elsewhere, and have these good conversations with our kids? I really like this image when we're talking about basically any behavior when it comes to working with kids, this idea that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. And I think as adults, when we're working with kids, it's really helpful for us to remember that even with our best intentions, we're not always going to be able to understand or to control rather what our kids are doing, right? We might be able to control while they're in front of us or while they're in their bedrooms or while they're connected to our Wi-Fi, but they're going to go out into the world and they're going to do what they're going to do. And if we don't understand why they're doing what they're doing, then it's going to create, distance between us and them. If we can start to understand why they're doing what they're doing and have more supportive and influential conversations with them, then we're going to be able to be supportive around the choices that they're going to make as they become more independent. And this is really important, right? We're kind of setting up good decision making for them rather than being that, staunch fist of control that rarely works. This is another image that I really like to share with our audiences, and it's this iceberg image here. And this is something that we use at Pine River. At Pine River, we get a lot of kids who struggle with addictive behavior. Sometimes that's drugs and alcohol. Sometimes it's tech and screen issues. But really what we want to start doing is thinking about those behaviors, whatever the symptom is, whether it's drugs or screens or gambling, as a way that our kids are coping with what's happening for them internally. We only see the top of this iceberg. We only see their coping behaviors. And if we only address the coping behaviors and say, if that behavior just goes away, everything would be fine, we're going to miss this bigger picture here, this bigger piece of the iceberg, which we know is hidden from the surface. So these are our feelings. These are how we think about the world, our perceptions of the world and whether it's a safe place or not, our beliefs, our expectations, our values. And really at the very bottom of this is our sense of self or our self-esteem, right? Kids that have lower self-esteem, even adults that have a lower self-esteem, are going to have more negative feelings about the world. They're going to have more negative perceptions, and that often leads to more maladaptive or dangerous coping behaviors. So if we can really, work to get past just thinking about things in terms of what the kids are doing and understanding why they're doing them, then we're going to have more success in influencing our kids. So this is the book Behind Their Screens that I took a lot of this research from. So if you're interested in diving deeper into what we're going to be talking about tonight, this would be a great resource for you. It's really, kind of trying to see screens from a kid's perspective rather than looking over the shoulder of from an adult perspective and trying to figure out what's going on. So lots of interviews with real kids and real teenagers about what it is that they are facing, and the good and the bad things that they find when they're talking about their screen use. The thesis of this book really is that developmentally, or from an adolescent perspective, the most important thing for kids is to preserve their peer relationships, or put another way, it's to stay connected to their friends. This is really the most important thing for adolescents. And you can imagine that if you are a teenager that's lived through COVID or are currently living through COVID, that impulse to protect your friendships was really, really put into question, right? Because they weren't going to school, they weren't allowed to see their peers. And luckily, we had this technology that made it available so that they could continue to have friendships and social groups and get the gossip and be in part of the clique, even while they weren't doing that in person. Now, I want you to just, if you're an adult, I want you to just go back in your memory to a time when you were a teenager, and try to think about maybe some of the silly or dangerous or reckless things that you may have done as a teenager to try and either impress, somebody that you liked, or become part of a group, or to just maintain those friendships, right? And when we can remember those things that we did and look back and laugh and say, oh yeah, I was a bit stupid, we can have more connection with what's going on with our kids today. It's very, very similar. It's just happening in a digital space rather than happening in the real world like it was for us. So these are some things to keep in mind as we're going through this presentation tonight, that no matter what, we can all relate to being young, and we can all relate to that idea of how important it is to feel connection to our friends and our social circles. And that when we were young, we did some pretty silly things to stay in those circles, right? And kids today are not different. They have just different access to technology. Another thing to keep in mind is that screens are not going away. Maybe there's some of us out there that wished we could go back into, the 70s or the 80s when times were easier, supposedly. But that is not the trajectory of technology. Things are only going to become more and more invasive. If you've ever watched, sci-fi futuristic shows, then you'll know that technology is just, it's going to take off and become more invasive and more advanced. So we need to make friends with screens. Thirdly, that this is not just a problem for kids. I think a lot of us sometimes see kids as developing, and we want to protect them from the technology that's out there. But then at the end of the day, we're having a hard time putting our phones away or turning off the TV before bed, or things like this, right? So again, just having that connection and that empathy for how difficult it can be. And finally, for many of us, this is not our medium. I grew up with Game Boys and Ghetto Blasters. Some of you may have grown up with record players and radios. But along the way, every time a new technology came out, the generation that was older thought, oh my goodness, this is going to be the thing that ruins humanity, right? The printing press, the radio, the television, they were all listed as being things that was going to really endanger society. And the internet is no different. Definitely there are different dangers and risks out there, and we're going to talk about some of those things. But really, this is about understanding that these things are here to stay, and we need to help our kids learn how to navigate them rather than just saying, just stay away from those devices altogether. So the internet is a tool. And I think a lot of us, we're here tonight. I have a webcam. I have 2 computers. I feel very tech savvy. I'm not. But the internet is a tool that can make our lives much easier. And particularly over the pandemic, it has definitely made our lives, I don't know if I'd say easier, but allowed us to continue in a way that, we were kind of living previously. It can make our lives more enjoyable. I can stream any show that I want. It's great. But just like other tools, the internet has risks and safety considerations. And so thinking about this kind of in the way that you would think about allowing your child to use a vehicle, for example, or a miniature chainsaw. You want to make sure that before you hand over the keys to your car, that your child knows the rules of the road. They know how to operate their vehicle safely. They know what's going to happen if they do 150 kilometers an hour on the highway. We're very, very good at teaching our kids how to be prepared to get their driver's license. And we have a series of testing regimes that we put them through. But when it comes to the internet, a lot of us are just saying, here you go. I'm not really sure how this works. I hope you don't get into trouble. So imagine giving the keys of your car to a 12-year-old and saying, here you go. Try not to go crash into a ditch. We would never do that with vehicles. So we want to start having that same understanding when it comes to the internet. Now, the problem, as I mentioned, is that a lot of us aren't as familiar with the internet as we are with vehicles because we didn't grow up with it, and we don't have the time. And because of the last 2 years being as crazy as it was, a lot of us have used the internet and screens as a way for us to do the job that we need to do, whether it's, taking care of other children, doing a work report, making dinner. A lot of us have gone into survival mode when it comes to screens and just said, here, I need 50 minutes. Why don't you watch this show? Now, that's not to say that that was wrong. I definitely did that as well. But now that we're kind of coming out of this idea of the pandemic, hopefully, we want to start thinking about how we're doing this with our kids. This is another great resource if people are interested. This is a book that was co-written by Gabor Mate and Gordon Neufeld. And the latest edition has a chapter on raising kids in a digital world. I'm going to summarize a bit of that chapter for you, but another resource if you're interested. And they say that, children and young people can be granted access to technology in a safe manner, but only when they're ready for it, when they have developed sufficiently so that the use of technology will enhance their growth rather than undermine it. And our job as the caregivers and parents in their lives, in the meantime, is not to put temptation in the way. So here's a picture that I like to show adults. It's a lovely buffet of candies and sweets and sugary things. And it's this idea here that, if I invited you to my house and I laid out this massive banquet of really unhealthy food, and then I turned to you and I said, I want you to have some broccoli for dinner, chances are most of us would not eat any broccoli and we would just dive into these sweet snacks, right? So even as adults, it's very hard for us to resist temptation when it is right in front of us. And when we have full-blown access to it, again, it's not within our capacity always to make the wise choice. Now, many of us as adults are asking our kids or our teenagers who we know have underdeveloped brains, who are not able to resist temptation, to do just that, right? To put the phones away and go outside and play or do your homework. And it's going to be very, very difficult for kids to do that without there being some sort of limit or boundary set by the adult. So many of you might know this, and I'm not a neuroscientist. So, if this is of interest to you, please do a bit more research. But really, what we're recognizing is that the human brain is not fully mature until about the age of 25. And it's a little bit later if you've experienced any sort of developmental trauma, or if you have any kind of, brain wiring concerns like ADHD or a learning disability. So just recognizing that it's much later than we originally thought, of having what we would consider to be a fully developed adult brain. And we're asking kids at 13 or 15 to, have all of this functioning available to them. In times of stress, kids are not going to be able to access the part of their brain that's still developing. It's known as the prefrontal cortex, and it's this little area right above your left eyebrow. And if your brain had a CEO, this is where the office would be, right? So this is the part of the brain that's responsible for judgment, decision-making, impulse control. Should I send that picture to this person I just met on Snapchat? Probably a good idea if I'm 13, not a great idea if I'm 30, right? So I'm able to have different faculty of thought. Things like risk assessment. This is all handled in this area of the brain that is still very much maturing for our teenagers. Excuse me. So besides brain growth, what else is going on developmentally? As I mentioned before, this idea of being liked by our peers becomes very, very important. It's sort of the job of teenagers is to be liked by their peers. While this is happening, our self-esteem also tends to decrease. So as kids, we're very, carefree and happy and a bit self-focused. And as we become teenagers, our self-esteem tends to go down. Puberty is coming online, our body's changing, things are just happening for us that are not a part of our concern when we're kids. Adult influence becomes less meaningful, and specifically parent influence becomes less meaningful, right? When we become teenagers, we're learning how to become our own person. And sometimes this means really rejecting or pushing away the adults in our lives who are trying to shape us. So a lot of this just becomes, again, very normalized, that sort of idea of rebellion. Again, remember when you were a teenager, this definitely happened for me. And really trying to form our own path or make our own way, which for parents can feel like rejection or defiance or opposition, right? So just remembering that a certain amount of this is developmentally appropriate. Sometimes we're pushing back on rules or we're talking back. And for us, I think when we were growing up, or certainly for when I was growing up, there was this idea that, you had to respect your parents no matter what, and that any talk back was unacceptable. So now we have to relearn as the adults that this is actually a very normal developmental stage for teens to go through. And to understand what's happening for them rather than being punitive about it. Again, for teenagers, taking risks becomes more important than being safe. So teenagers are very good at taking risks. And again, it's developmentally appropriate. And there's actually some science to show that teenagers who tend to take more risks tend to be more successful adults because they've been able to push the boundaries on what is acceptable. Long-term consequences are less important than the instant reward, right? So when you are trying to have a conversation with your child about, if you put that picture up online, it's going to stay there forever, they don't really care because they're getting 60 or 100 likes. And for them, the thing that's happening right now is more important than the thing that's going to happen in the future. Self-regulation is not always available. What this means is that teenagers have big mood swings. That's to be expected. That's quite normal. Again, it's partly about this development of their brain biology and things not always being logical or reasonable. Oftentimes when we're not able to access this frontal part of our brain, we go into an emotional part of our brain, and that's when we see big reactions to things. So again, this is just to paint a picture about what is happening developmentally, what is considered, normal, and to be able to empathize and have compassion for that as parents, even though it's frustrating for us. So then with all of this understanding behind us, we really need to start thinking about the fact that it's not that teens are not thinking or that they're being thoughtless in their actions. It's more true that what they're thinking about and more concerned with is very different from what we as adults think is right. So we're kind of speaking two different languages here. And this is a picture that's probably familiar to you if you have teenagers at home. This idea that it feels like you're talking, you're lecturing, you're giving good examples, and your kids just don't get it. And they don't. And they probably won't until they get a bit older. So our job then is to learn how to speak a different language, right? We're not going to change what we think is important, but we're just going to learn how to communicate it in a different way so that it's more receptive and our kids are more likely to hear it. Okay, so let's dispel this myth that all kids have a tech addiction. There are certain criteria that kids would have to meet or teenagers would have to meet in order to be, diagnosed as having a tech addiction. Now, tech addiction is not part of the mental health catalog. It's not part of the DSM-5 yet, but they are there are talks of including it eventually. But there's certainly kids out there who really have what we would consider problematic behavior. We see some of these kids at Pine River. And these are very extreme cases. So for the most part, I would not consider most kids having a tech addiction or a gaming addiction, but these are some of the symptoms that you would want to look out for, right? So a complete preoccupation with whatever it is, whatever the device is that you're concerned with, having withdrawal symptoms, having really big tantrums when tech is taken away, not sleeping, not eating, a loss of outside activities, and lying about use. These are some things that if you're seeing in somebody that you care for, that you would want to reach out to your general practitioner and get some more support around, because this is a very serious concern that you as a parent at home, as an individual, are probably not going to be able to manage on your own. So most kids, I would say, do not fall under that category. But there are lots of kids out there who have a really hard time putting their devices down. So we're just going to look at video games specifically for a few moments here. These things can also apply to other forms of media. So if you have someone at your home who's very into social media or really into TikTok, there are some overlaps here, but this is research specifically done around video games and why they're so difficult to put away. And really what it comes down to is this idea of the hierarchy of needs. Like, what are the needs that kids have at this age? And again, particularly preteen and adolescent boys specifically. What are their needs at this time developmentally, and how are video games really mapping onto those needs? So I'm going to explain a little bit more about this. So the first thing, again, we talked about peer relationships. The first part is socialization. Now, as adults looking at our kids playing video games, we might think that it is a solo activity, right? They're spending all their time in their room. They're not talking to anybody. They don't have those in-person conversations. Now, that's a bit of an archaic idea of socialization that we brought from the 80s and 90s, because kids right now are socializing hugely through video game play. There's massive multiplayer games where kids are connecting with people, all over the world. Maybe for us, those don't feel like authentic friendships, but for the kids that are doing these things, those feel like real friendships and real authentic connections. This is especially true if you have a child who might have a bit of social anxiety or has a bit of a hard time making connections in person. They're able to find relationships and socialization and people who are like them through playing a video game. So if you're playing Call of Duty and you're always playing with somebody who also likes Call of Duty, eventually you're going to start a relationship and you're going to figure out that there's more things that you have in common. This is friendship, that's relationship, whether it makes sense to us or not. So big socialization. There's also, outside of just playing the actual game, there's also tons of websites and streaming services for people who are interested in the game. So you can go on Discord and you can watch somebody playing the game that you like, and then you can chat with other people about the game that you like. Massive socialization. The second one is this need for mastery and competency. Again, this is a need that really comes online in adolescence as we become more independent, and we know eventually we're going to be leaving our nest or our adult home, where we know that we need to get good at stuff. Otherwise, we're not going to be successful in the world. Now, video games are developed in such a way that they are very, very addictive, I would say, in catching kids by giving them little tastes of getting better at things. So you start at a basic level and then you play for a while and suddenly you've unlocked a new skill and you're better at something. That feels really good for a kid who might not have success at school, who might be having academic struggles, who might not be very athletic. They're finding a place where they can be good at something and get better at something. So that's a huge, huge developmental need that kids have, and a lot of them are finding it through playing video games. The third one is this need for autonomy. So again, I mentioned, we can all probably remember feeling like we wanted to be free of our parents and that we were ready to be adults. This is very normal teenage behavior. And in video games, we have the ultimate autonomy. Not only do we get to create our character, our avatar, who can look like whatever we want it to look like, we can sometimes create our own world. So if we're not having social success in this world, then we can plug in and go online and be part of a world that we have complete autonomy over. Sounds pretty sweet, right? And for a 15-year-old boy, it's obviously very difficult to say, you know what, I'm just going to turn this off and go for a walk with my mom. So there's lots of reasons why it's hard for kids to give up video games. And these are the sort of big three needs that video games are really meeting for our kids. Here are a couple other examples. Obviously, they can change our mood. Sometimes not for the better. Sometimes they can make us more angry. But often if we've had a hard day at school, we come home, we play for a bit, and we're feeling better. They have a slot machine effect, so we never really know what's going to happen. So the same way that a lot of people get addicted to gambling, this is what's happening for kids when they're playing video games. It satisfies that need for immediate gratification, right? Because things are happening right now in the moment. I don't have to wait 2 weeks to see a result, and it's going to fulfill that need that I have for immediate gratification. And then finally, it creates a world of fantasy and escape. And let's be honest, who would not want to escape the world that we currently live in, where there's so much unpredictability, even about whether or not there's going to be school in 2 weeks. Is there going to be another outbreak? Can I spend time with my family over Christmas? There's a lot of hectic things going on in our world right now. And it makes sense why our most vulnerable population would want to escape that for a period of time. So the good news is that when we know the needs that our kids have and how they're getting them met on video games, is that we can find other ways to help them get their needs met. So we're not going to be able to eliminate what video games do for kids, but we can bring in other elements of their lives that can help them get those things they need. So for example, socialization, right? Based on your comfort level, you can start increasing family time with distant relatives, making sure that they're connected to peers at school, helping to support their friendships and making sure that they have opportunities for those connections. Sometimes that might look like extracurricular activities or clubs or whatever the case may be. The other thing in terms of mastery and competency, asking your young person if they're age appropriate to go out and get a part-time job or start contributing more to chores around the home. There's lots of things that need to be done at home, and asking kids to increase the amount of chores that they're doing at home is going to do two things. One, it's naturally going to keep them off of screens because they're busy doing something else. And two, it's going to give them that motivation, that mastery, that's going to build their self-esteem over time. Now, kids are not going to say, gee, thanks, Mom, for giving me extra chores. I'm so glad you're helping me develop my mastery. They're going to grumble about it. And that's okay, because that's a level of stress that they can tolerate. And being able to work through that stress is actually going to help them deal with bigger stresses in the end. So bring on the chores. Big fan of chores. The third thing is, for kids that are a bit older, maybe a bit more mature, is sit them down and have a conversation with them around what they think their expectations should be. You know, a lot of kids will say, I think it's appropriate to play 2 hours of video games a night. And then they get into the world and they get kind of swept away, and sooner or later they're playing 5, 6, 7 hours. So they're getting swept away. But when they're rational, when they have that prefrontal cortex online, they're able to make good choices and set good limits for themselves. So we just kind of need to be there as a gatekeeper and say, okay, hey, you said 2 hours, we're going into hour 3, it's time to shut it off. When they're more engaged in the rules that they have, they're gonna feel like they have a bit of that autonomy that they're striving for. So the last piece I'm going to say about video games is this idea of dopamine. And again, some of you might have heard of this idea. So video games, really exciting movies, you know, a lot of the Marvel movies right now are really what we would call high dopamine activity. So dopamine is that chemical that gets released in our brain that makes us feel good. It's a very pleasurable thing. We all seek it. It's very important for us to survive. When we have high dopamine in our brain, it can be really nice for a few moments or for an evening. But if that's a sustained thing, if our brain is constantly being flooded with dopamine, our brain does this self-regulation thing where it says, hey, that's a lot of dopamine. I'm going to shut down some of the receptors or some of the doorways that dopamine is coming in through. What this means is that the next day, when you go to read a book or you're petting your dog or you're going for a walk, there's fewer doorways for dopamine to get into, and it doesn't feel as pleasurable or as nice as it did, you know, a week before. So this is why we tend to see kids who play a lot of really high action video games losing interest in things that are not providing them with that big dopamine rush, right? Again, it just comes down to your brain and what your brain wants. And so recognizing that if this is something that you're seeing in kids that you have in your home, that this might be the culprit here. This is the same mechanism by which people get hooked on things like cocaine, again, gambling, become, you know, addicts in their life. This is the same mechanism in the brain that's working. And it's happening to kids at quite a young age. So just recognizing if this is something that you need to take a break from for a while. Encouraging low dopamine activities for a sustained period of time can help rebalance that activation in your brain. So I just included a little list here of things that are examples of low dopamine activities. But a big part of that, if you're noticing that in your kids, is really to have that reset and do a bit of unplugging for a while. You can make this a family challenge so that you're all kind of doing it together and grumbling through it together. Because your kids are really going to have a hard time adjusting if they've come from this place of having really high dopamine activities. But there's lots of things that we can do to kind of get them back on track. So this is my last point about video games, just to say that, and this is the part your kids are actually going to like about my presentation, that moderate video game playing has actually been shown to be beneficial and can enhance psychological well-being in youth. Now, the key word is moderate here. You know, there's a lot of team building, turn taking, puzzle solving. You know, it really does activate a lot of different areas of our brains, depending on the type of games that your kids are playing. But playing more than 3 hours a day, which still feels like a lot for most of us, can actually reverse these effects, right? So just recognizing that kids have more time in the day than we do, and it's very easy for kids to slip into video game world for more than 3 hours a day. Again, not all games are created equal. So there's a big difference between Minecraft and Call of Duty. And if you don't know what that difference is, I would recommend you go check out Common Sense Media. That's going to help you. Just like other media, it's important to look at screen content and age restrictions, because there are video games that have nudity. There are video games that have drug and alcohol use. And we don't know that as parents unless we do our research. There's no link between violence in video games and aggression or aggressive behavior. There's no research that supports that. However, there is a link between watching a lot of violence, whether it's in video games or in TV shows, and what's known as a desensitization, or just, not registering violence in the real world. And my last point is that gaming will not cause ADHD. However, a lot of kids who really struggle with ADHD and perhaps maybe undiagnosed are drawn towards gaming because it really helps to keep them stimulated and can actually have a bit of a calming effect on kids who are struggling with ADHD. Okay, so the next point is around where these devices live. And this can be relevant whether we're talking about a gaming system or a tablet or a phone. And recognizing that when devices are put into bedrooms, kids tend to disappear, right? I've had so many parents come to me and say, I spent a lot of money on a really amazing gaming system for my 14-year-old, and now they don't come out of their room. And I think, like, well, of course, like if I had a really nice gaming system in my bedroom, I probably wouldn't come out of the room either, especially if someone was bringing me meals and getting me to school every morning. So, just making sure, if you do have devices in kids' bedrooms, I completely understand. They're loud, they're bright, they're noisy, they're a bit obnoxious. And as a parent of 2 children, I don't want that in my main living space. And I would tend to want to get it out of my main living space. The problem is that then your kids disappear and you have no idea what they're doing. And it can lead to all of these or correlate to all of these sort of difficulties that we see. A big one being access to inappropriate content, right? Because if you're in your bedroom with your door closed and you're a 14-year-old boy and you have access to the internet, who knows what you're getting up to in there. This is just to say that if you're noticing some of these problems happening with your kid, whether it's lack of sleep or a more sedentary lifestyle, that you might want to reevaluate whether those devices stay in the bedroom, right? And making this perhaps a privilege that they can earn rather than something that they're just entitled to. So saying, hey, we're noticing that you're having a hard time sleeping. We want to help support you with that. We're going to move your device into the living room or the dining room or somewhere that's more central, just so that there's a bit of separation between where you sleep and where you play. What responsibilities do you want to see from your kid in order to get this privilege back, right? Do they need to start getting up every morning on their own? Do their grades need to improve? This is something that you need to figure out based on the situation you have going on in your home. And again, for parents to have the power to make these decisions for their kids. Making sure that you're clearly communicating what the limits are to them, and also clearly communicating what the consequences are if they're not able to manage the privilege, right? So we'll try this again for a week. We'll put the device back in your room. If we notice that your sleep is tapering off again, we're going to pull it back out of your room. And just being very clear and open about, we understand that this is important to you. We're not going to take it away altogether, because that's where parents tend to go, to this all or nothing. We're not going to take away the system altogether. We just want it to be in a more centralized location. One of the things, sorry, just before I finish on that point, one of the things that I think really strikes me from when I was a kid is that I had a brother. He was 8 years older. We had one television. So my brother and I would often fight over what we wanted to do on this television. Now, a parent today would say, I'm just going to solve this problem by buying both my kids a television, which seems like a good solution, except what it takes away is this ability for kids to navigate and compromise how to share this one resource, right? So yes, it's going to minimize the fighting that's happening in your household, perhaps, but these chances or these opportunities are really great learning moments for your kids to say, okay, you get the TV from 6 till 7, I get the TV from 7 till 8. And in that hour where I'm not on the TV, I'm going to have to find something else to entertain myself. And this is what we would want to see as parents, right? So again, minimizing those temptations for our kids is going to help them do that. All right, so things to pay attention to. Is this an addiction? I already did this one, excuse me. So the most significant problems associated with screen time, as I mentioned, are sleep, sedentary lifestyle, and mental health challenges. So we're going to go through them one by one. Sleep, if you have a child who is not sleeping, you're going to see some of these symptoms pop up, right? Agitation, low mood, maybe poor school performance, trouble focusing. They're going to have poor emotional regulation. Sleep is probably the number one thing that we can do that is free and accessible to most people, hopefully, unless you have insomnia, that can help promote our mental health. If you get a good night's sleep, it can change the way you feel about the world. A lot of these symptoms that people will start to exhibit when they don't have good sleep are the same things that people or parents specifically will say are a result of too much screen time, right? So really, what is the culprit here? Is it too much screen time, or is it not enough sleep because of screen time? Now, if we remove screens, that doesn't necessarily mean that sleep is going to improve. So we might have to pay closer attention to what's going on and support our kids in their good sleep hygiene. How do we do this? Again, getting those devices out of bedrooms. When you have a really stimulating environment in your bedroom, and then all of a sudden it becomes bedtime and you have to go to bed, it's very hard for your brain to think, okay, now it's sleeping. I'm sleeping in the same room where I was just, going around and killing a bunch of people on Call of Duty. To make that switch is very difficult. So seeing if maybe pulling the screens out of the bedroom is going to help. Trying to coach your children around having no screens at least an hour before bed, trying to bring some of those low dopamine activities into their schedule, into their rapport an hour before bed. This is very hard to do. It's hard for adults to do, and it's very hard for kids to do. If you do it together, it creates a nice opportunity for everyone to kind of grumble at each other and, oh, this is so hard, and oh, last night you failed, and oh no, tonight you're going to fail, and to create a bonding moment over how difficult it can be to put your screens away. I tried to do this while I was writing this presentation last year, and I think I went 3 days without having my phone in my, at my bedside table. Other things, try to keep a consistent schedule between weekends and weekdays. I love sleeping in. I know how nice it is to sleep in, but if you have really big sleep-ins on the weekends or at holidays, it's going to be harder come Monday morning to get back on schedule. And also remembering that teenagers need more sleep than both adults and children. So on average, teenagers need about 9 to 9.5 hours of sleep each night. They're also more likely to want to stay awake later and to sleep in later. That's just what happens during adolescence in their rhythm cycle. Excuse me. And we need to tell the school board to keep up with that. That's a different webinar. But it is going to be harder for them to go to sleep kind of before 11 o'clock. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so sedentary routines. Obviously, the more time you spend sitting on a computer or a game or whatever it is, you're not moving your body, you're not exercising, and this can be related to unhealthy behaviors and undesirable health outcomes, right? Most notably obesity, but also other things that come as a result of that. The good news is that we can support our kids even through their tech to have better goals for moving their body. There's a lot of attention right now on TikTok and TikTok challenges that are happening. TikTok dances. Again, if you don't know what TikTok is, go to Common Sense Media and find out. But try to find creative ways to get your kids moving. Sometimes this is going to look like time together going for a walk, but it could be, trying to learn how to do a ridiculous dance routine with your child. And they'll love it because you'll probably look ridiculous. Make it meaningful to them. And start with small goals, right? If you have a kid who really has been struggling to get up and get active, they're not going to be able to run a marathon. They might just be able to go for a walk around the block with you. And so really just encouraging those small goals to get a little bit of movement every day. So sleep is number one thing that we can do for our mental health. And diet and exercise is really number two. So very accessible to a lot of people, that if we move our bodies, it actually makes our body feel like we're good. And it can help override feelings of anxiety and depression that some kids might be facing as well. Okay, our last one is screen time and mental health. And specifically, when we're talking about screen time and mental health, a lot of the research has been done specifically on social media use. So having those sites like Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook less so, but TikTok, these do seem to have an influence on how people feel about themselves. And that makes sense, right? If you've ever spent any time on Instagram or gone through, what a typical teenage profile might look like, there's a lot of people who are living their best life, who are looking like their best self, who are using filters to be beautiful. And of course, it's going to make people feel like they're inadequate. Excuse me. This is particularly true where we see a negative influence on mental health in young female identified people, so around ages of 10 to 13, because this tends to be the age and the gender category where we see a lot of poor self-esteem anyway. So even before screen time, even before social media, we would recognize that this age category was more vulnerable to how they felt about their appearance and how other people feel about their appearance. And now they have this little thing in their pocket that's constantly there to remind them that, hey, I'm not an Instagram model, right? So of course, there's going to be a negative influence there. So again, just to remember, we can relate to this. I can certainly relate to this. I remember being in grade 8 and the feelings that came along with that. Social media did not create a lack of self-esteem for youth, but it's definitely not making it any better. So what are some things to watch out for when it comes to mental health? There's a whole list here. And I think many of us as adults are pretty keyed into the things that we need to pay attention to. Recognizing, again, that low mood is normal, but sustained low mood or sustained helplessness, those are things that we want to be paying more attention to. An increased fixation on appearance and body image, again, especially for young women, but not always young women. So this can also affect young boys. Noticing after they spend time on social media, what is their mood like, and reflecting that back to them. These are things that if you're noticing a lot of, that you may want to have a conversation with your family doctor about getting more support around. So knowing what your child's vulnerabilities are and not making assumptions about what the vulnerabilities are. Asking open-ended questions, right? Learning how to listen to your kids talk about what it is that they're experiencing online rather than saying, oh, we should just put our phones away. That's all a bunch of gobbledygook, right? It was really cluing into the fact that these are very important things for our kids and they're very meaningful for them, and that we need to learn how to listen to their problems and their concerns. Learning how to allow feelings to be expressed. Sometimes we as adults feel like we don't have time for this. And learning to sit with hard feelings. So sitting with anger, sitting with sadness. If you have a child who comes to you and says, I feel like I'm so ugly, that's a really hard emotion to sit with. And rather than saying, no, you're beautiful and you're so great and one day everyone's going to love you, is really getting curious about that feeling for them and saying, okay, that sounds really difficult. Like, can you tell me what that feels like every day? How does that feel when you go to school, when you feel this way about yourself? You know, getting curious and having that openness to explore conversations. Encouraging and modeling check-ins. So sometimes our kids are brick walls and they don't want to talk to us about anything. And so just making this a part of your family routine or the routine in your home where, you know, every Sunday night we do a check-in. Show me which emoji you feel like you are today. Sometimes kids are better at doing this through text rather than face-to-face conversation. So, you know, being friends with your kid online and having a text conversation about how they're feeling. Perfectly valid, and you might actually get more expression through a text message than you would through a face-to-face conversation. When you start with this with really young kids, it just becomes part of the routine and then more normalized. It's going to be harder to start with teenagers for sure. And you might need to incentivize that a little bit. That's up to you. And then finally, knowing the signs of mental health, that list that I put up earlier, and when you need to get more support. These are big, big challenges. And it's a lot to do on top of everything else that you're already doing to support your families. So making sure that you're taking care of yourself as well, and recognizing when your own mental health gets triggered. Okay, so this is the awkward part of the conversation, and I'm just going to acknowledge that it's a bit awkward. And this is what you can do when you start having this conversation with your kids. This is awkward. We're going to talk about it anyway, because it's really important. Kids are very curious about sex. Again, this is very developmentally appropriate. Eventually, they're probably going to have sex. And they're going to go out into the world and they're going to look for partners. Now, when we were kids, we got a conversation about this around, 14, 15, maybe we got some sex ed at school, but kids are getting exposed a lot earlier than we did because they have access to this technology, right? So the average age of first seeing sexually explicit imagery online is 11. That's an average age. So if you have 8, 9, 10-year-olds in your home, this would be the time to start having these conversations. It's a lot younger than we might think. Now, most of the time, the first time you look at something, it's not intentional, but things kind of appear on our web pages and come across our desks, or we get shown by a friend, right? So, and then that kind of just opens the floodgates to what's available. Because kids want to know about how their bodies work and they want to learn about how other people's bodies work and what happens when you put those two bodies together, they're going to seek out this information, whether it's from a reliable source like you or your mental health practitioner or your public health nurse or the internet or the kid that they sit next to on the bus, right? So we need to start thinking about who do we want this, where do we want this information to be coming from? And how can I give my child reliable information? If that's not something that you feel comfortable doing personally, that's fine, but maybe making sure that there is someone there to fill that gap for your kids. A lot of parents are very concerned about sexting and don't really even know what it is. So I'm going to give you a very broad definition here. Sexting is actually the act of sending any sexual message. So it could be a text, or it could be a recording. It could be a photo, a video. There's lots of different ways that sexting can happen. And again, this behavior begins a lot earlier than what we might think. It usually starts around middle school, so around the ages of 10 to 13. And if you'll notice, there's a correlation here. I just think this is interesting, that sexting tends to happen around the same time when young girls are starting to feel, less confident in who they are, their bodies and things like that. So statistically speaking, male students are doing the asking for sex, and female students are doing the sending. Now, what this means is that it doesn't matter if you have young boys or young girls in your home, that there is a conversation to be had for both of them, right? So how do we support this? First of all, you got to manage your own anxiety, regulate yourself. If this is not something that you feel like you can do, that's okay. But bringing in, the cool aunt or the older cousin or somebody who can do this conversation for you. learn about and talk about what it means to give informed consent. And Andrea and I were talking about consent a little earlier, and really what does it mean? Ever send sex messages, and you know what, don't ever, just never have sex, and like don't ever think about it again. That would be nice if we could have that kind of control over our children. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. And so what we want to do is give them the best information so that when they are confronted with something like this, that they're going to be able to make good choices for themselves. And if they don't know what to do in a situation, that they're going to feel like you are a safe person to come and talk to. Hey, I got this message. How do I navigate this, right? Or, hey, I don't know what to do. I got asked this question and I'm not sure what to do. What do you think I should do? Most of the time, kids want the support, and they just feel like their parents or their caregivers will get them in trouble or don't understand. So trying to be, again, non-judgmental, open, curious, empathic. Again, start earlier than you think you need to, because these conversations need to happen much earlier. And don't wait for them to come to you, because no kid is going to go to their parent and say, let's have the sex talk now. That's not usually how it works. Remember that curiosity is normal and very healthy for kids. And actually, the studies show that the more information we give, whether it's about sex or drugs or alcohol, the less likely our kids are to engage in those things. Right. So a lot of parents have thought for years, I don't want to talk about drugs with my kids because then they're going to go do drugs. It's actually the opposite is true. So when we have conversations about sex with our kids, it actually delays when they have sex for the first time. And it means that they're going to have safer sex when they do eventually start, because they're more informed. Okay, and finally, what is the biggest predictor of a child's phone use? This may or may not be surprising to people out there, but the biggest predictor is actually their parents' use. So if you want to have good habits at home, really modeling for your kid, what is appropriate? When is it time to put the phone away? Talking about, oh, I put my phone away for the night. It's really difficult for me to do that, but I think it's really important. So I'm going to try and go the next 2 hours without my phone. Do you want to play a game with me? Or do you want to go for a walk? Or can we do something to distract? And just making that really relatable and human, right? Kids really appreciate that vulnerability in their parents. And it's really good modeling for us to show them. Okay, this is just my final slide on what can I do right now. So sort of a wrap up of what we've talked about tonight. I know it's a lot of information, and you might be a little dazed right now thinking, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do. First and foremost is just, recognize that we're all on our screens more today. And what counts as screen time for you? Does being homeschooled online, does that count as screen time? Because that probably doesn't count as screen time to your kids. Learning how to set limits around media, right? You get to decide what the limits are based on what you want to see in your home, what you value. And no one else should be able to tell you what your limits are, especially your children. So you get to set them. Sometimes having a clear list of priorities or chores or responsibilities that your child has to complete before they get into media is a good idea. If your kids are spending lots of time on media, maybe it means they have more capacity to do a couple more chores around the house. So that's a win-win. Bring the media into a centralized location, as I said, which limits the opportunity for kids to disappear. Look at creating opportunities to connect offline, and those low dopamine activities that we talked about, make that a connection that you can have as a unit, as a family. And then ask questions about what they're doing. What do they like? What do they not like? What's difficult to navigate? What do they wish they could get rid of? What do they think is amazing? Kids, when you have these conversations, you'll find that they actually have a lot of thoughtful things to say about some of the negative consequences of screen time. And it might interest you to hear what those things are for your kids. And then finally, just to empathize with how hard it can be to put those devices away, while also monitoring those healthy habits that you want to see in your kids. This can be a great family challenge, and your kids will think it's hilarious when you're struggling as well. Okay, and that's all I have for everyone tonight. So I'm happy to take any questions. I think there's a few in the chat already. Those might be other things, but happy to hear from anyone.
Thank you so much for Amanda for that. That was a lot of great information and tips. I'm going to stop the recording now. So people, if somebody wants to ask a question, they can either unmute themselves or add it to the chat.